Today's episode is for the 25th day of the month of Teves. We are in the middle of chapter 46, discussing different laws of non-kosher foods. Today we're doing paragraph 17 through paragraph 29. So we're in the middle of discussing the chain of custody that kosher items require, and if you're sending something that is kosher with somebody who's not Jewish or doesn't keep kosher, then what do you need to ensure the person receiving it, what do they need to see to ensure that this food is still kosher, that nothing was switched out, nothing wasn't tampered with, etc. So if somebody's sending an item, a food item, in a sack with somebody who doesn't keep kosher, then the sack should be something which has stitches, internal stitches. That way that the stitches can't be opened up from the outside and resealed. It would be clear if that happened because stitches are internal. And it also has to be tied with a knot and have a seal over the knot. So if the knot is untied, then the person's seal would be messed up. Paragraph 18. If a package containing meat was sent with somebody who doesn't keep kosher and the receiver doesn't see any seal on it, he wants to know if he could eat it, he should make sure to call his local Orthodox competent rabbi, because sometimes he might be able to eat it, sometimes not. So make sure to have a rabbi on call. Paragraph 19. Cheese and other food items as well, that if they were delivered by somebody who doesn't keep kosher, then even if they're sealed in ways that Jews commonly seal their foods, if you don't know the person who sealed them, then you're still not able to eat it. You have to speak to a rabbi to make sure that's okay to eat. Now, practically speaking, this is very nice about generally somebody sending somebody else food via Uber, etc. When you buy food in the store, how do you know if it's kosher? There's a symbol on there, and because the copyright laws, because of governmental authority, if somebody puts a symbol on there they're not allowed to, they'll be sued, then that's enough to know that this food is kosher. You'll notice with meat, there's usually some sort of extra seal on there because meat and fish require an extra seal, as we discussed. The biggest problem where this comes up is if you order food from a kosher restaurant via Uber Eats or something of that sort. It's supposed to be sealed with some sort of tape which has the hashgacha, has a kosher certifying agency on it. If that tape isn't there, if it's not sealed, it comes in an unsealed bag, then you have a real problem, then you have a real dilemma, because that's the classic case of kosher food sent with somebody who doesn't keep kosher. So could you eat that food or not? So that does get a bit technical. It depends whether you recognize the food, you know what type of food the store sends, how they package the food, etc. Call a rabbi if you have such a scenario. But if you are ordering food, then hopefully the store that you're ordering it from is kosher certified. They know how to package it properly so that when you receive the food, you'll be able to eat it without a problem. The next few paragraphs discuss ensuring that kosher food and non-kosher food don't get mixed up with each other. So paragraph 20. If you have a stove and you have a Jew is cooking a pot of kosher food on the stove, and you have a non-Jew cooking on the burner right next to the kosher pot, non-kosher food, then both pots have to be covered. If the pots are uncovered, there's a concern that some food might splatter from one pot to the next, and that could cause major issues. So both pots have to be covered. Similarly, if you're cooking, you have a kosher kitchen in your house, and you have some food cooking on the stove, and you have a maid who's a non-Jewish maid or housekeeper who's in the house, so that could also create a problem because you never know what the housekeeper might add to the pot. So you have to make sure there's somebody who's going in and out. You don't have to have somebody there the entire time, but somebody popping in and out occasionally, so that the housekeeper would be nervous to add something to the pot because she might be caught. Paragraph 22. If you have a kosher kitchen, you should make sure to not leave your kosher items, your pots, pans, utensils, etc., in the house if somebody doesn't keep kosher, because they might end up using it and it could contaminate your items with non-kosher flavors, which would then end up affecting the food that you cook with it later on back in your house. Now, even when you give a pot or a utensil to a craftsman to fix, say something broke, you want to bring it someplace to be fixed, you have to make sure you have to just use your, keep an open mind. Is there a chance that this person might end up cooking with it? Even if they might, I'm just totally making up a case over here, but let's say you bring a pot got a crack and it's an expensive pot, you want to have it fixed, and you bring somebody who can fix it. Is there a chance that they'll fix it and then they'll put it on the stove to check to see if that seal they made holds? If things like that happen, it could create kosher issues. So anytime you're sending a pot to a non-kosher facility to be fixed or anything in the kitchen, I don't know how often people fix their pots, but let's say you have an appliance, let's say you have a toaster oven or something of that sort that broke and you do want to get that fixed. So you just have to make sure that you're being careful with how you're doing it and what the setting is that's going to be fixed in. If you're bringing somebody's house is different than bringing to a store that they might have. So you just have to keep an open mind. And you say in Pirkei Avos, Chacham Inav Barosho, that wise person thinks ahead and foresees any potential problem. And if something should come up, then make sure to speak to a rabbi, have a rabbi on call, to clarify afterwards if this would have been an issue or not. The next few paragraphs talk about the laws of Tereifah. Now, we're used to using the word treif to mean any non-kosher food. Food that we could eat is called kosher. Food we can't eat is typically called treif. But treif really is a halachic term. It comes from the word Tereifah, which refers to an animal which has some disease that it won't last 12 months. And the Talmud goes through different types of diseases that would make that would place an animal into this category called Tereifah. A Tereifah is not a kosher animal. So the way it works is that in a slaughterhouse, after they slaughter the animal, the next step is to open up the animal and check out the organs to make sure that the organs are all healthy. If there's some organs that are sick, they have to check whether it fits into one of these categories of a Tereifah, and if so, it would not be considered a kosher animal, even though it was slaughtered totally properly, even though it has the signs of a kosher animal. This specific animal would not be kosher because it might be a Tereifah. You might hear the term glatt kosher. Glatt kosher means that the lungs were checked for different possible concerns that would render this animal a Tereifah, an animal that is sick and therefore wouldn't be kosher. So the next few paragraphs discuss different laws about Tereifah, about animals that might be sick or have some disease which would render them unkosher even though they're slaughtered properly. So paragraph 23. It seems like it used to be a common practice in slaughtering houses that before they'd slaughter chickens or other types of birds, they'd throw it hard on the ground to kind of stun it and therefore be easier to slaughter it. Says the Shulchan Aruch, throwing an animal on the ground like that could render a Tereifah. The only way for it to lose its potential Tereifah status is if afterwards you see it get up and walk 4 amos, approximately 19 to 23 inches, you see it walking regularly that amount, totally normally, then you can say, okay, this animal isn't a Tereifah. But if you slaughter it before it does that, then you have to assume it's a Tereifah and it's not going to be a kosher animal. And this also applies to sheep, to cattle as well. We don't stun them before they slaughter them because that stunning them might render them a Tereifah. Paragraph 24. In the summertime, apparently, with geese specifically, it seems like there were some sort of blisters that they could develop on the intestines, and those blisters might render these geese a Tereifah. Therefore, after we slaughter the geese, we have to make sure to open them up and investigate, do an inspection of the intestines to check if these blisters are found. And if so, then a halachic authority should be consulted. Paragraph 25, switching topics again. In general, you're not allowed to make bread, which is kneaded with milk. Because bread is commonly eaten at meat meals, there is a concern if this bread has milk mixed into it, you might forget about it, or somebody might not know, and they might eat it with meat, and that would obviously be a major kosher concern. Therefore, there's a rabbinical decree that we don't mix milk into bread. There are a number of exceptions to this, however. That only applies by a full loaf, a regular size loaf. If you're having small loaves of bread, like small little rolls, the type that one person would eat this size roll by a meal, it's not something you divide amongst other people or for a whole table to have, then it is okay to have milk mixed into it. If it's some sort of unusual shape that people see it say, oh, there's something different about this bread, there'll also be another exception that would allow it to be dairy, to allow it to have milk mixed into it. And even though this generally is more of a concern with the milk because you find milk or dairy products mixed into bread, it's not as common to find meat products mixed into bread, but it would apply to meat as well. We're not supposed to mix gravy into bread for the same reasons, because we might end up eating this bread by a dairy meal. But again, the same thing. If it's a small roll that's only enough for one person at one sitting, or if it's an unusual shape, then it would be okay to have gravy mixed into it. Now, this isn't so common in Arab ovens because Arab ovens generally bake things on racks. But if somebody has an oven and they're baking things on the floor of the oven, and you're baking a loaf of bread, no dairy, no meat in this loaf of bread, a regular loaf of bread on the floor of the oven. And next to that, you have some other sort of dish which has meat or dairy in it. And then there's a concern that meat or dairy might ooze out some fluids and will end up touching the bread. And that could, again, be a problem because this bread might end up becoming dairy or meat. And dairy or meat bread is not kosher, generally speaking. Therefore, even eating this loaf of bread by itself now wouldn't be allowed. Paragraph 26. Let's say you have, like in one of our ovens, you have meat in an oven, and cooking in an oven, a roast, and you're also cooking bread, and you're baking bread in there as well. But because on racks, there's no concern of any liquid flowing from the roast to the bread. Parenthetically, it just makes me remember, made me think of something else. And even in our ovens, if you have a roast which is cooking on the top rack, and on the bottom rack you have challah, baking, that could be a problem because even though it's not on the same level on a flat surface, still there could be concern that some meat juice could go up, could drip out of the pot of the out of the roast, and could end up on top of the challah. So that would be a problem, like we had in last paragraph and paragraph 25. Paragraph 26 is where there's no concern of any juice from the meat touching the bread. However, there's a concern that the aroma from the meat might enter the bread, and that would render the bread meat bread. You wouldn't be able to have this meat with milchigs, with dairy, but it wouldn't be so meaty that would be a problem to be a problem of that decree that we just learned about in paragraph 25 of this being meat bread that you're not allowed to eat at all. So again, you have two levels. We had the first level we spoke about last paragraph where the bread itself has meat mixed into it or milk mixed into it. In that case, this loaf of bread becomes not kosher and you can't even eat it by itself unless one of the exceptions that we discussed in last paragraph. This is a new case where there's no actual meat in here, but it got some aroma from the meat. So this bread is still kosher. However, because it has meat aroma in it, then you could only eat it with meat. You cannot eat it with milk. But how does it get this aroma? So it needs two things. It needs to be in a sealed oven, an oven which has no ventilation at all. And also, it has to be where the meat was uncovered. If the meat was covered, we're not concerned about any aroma from the meat getting into the bread. If there's ventilation in this oven, it could be an open oven that has no door to it. You can think of the matzah bakery ovens that they're open in the front always, they're never sealed. Or a different type of oven that's not sealed in that case. Or if there's ventilation to the oven, then even if the meat is not sealed, even if the meat is open, they're still not concerned about the aroma of the meat getting into the bread because the aroma will be sucked out through the vent. But in general, says the Shulchan Aruch, it's not a good idea to have bread baking in an oven when you're cooking meat in the oven as well, even if it's a large oven, even if there's no concern about the aroma getting into it. It's just asking for trouble, so it's something to stay away from. Paragraph 27. Let's say you're cooking a roast in your oven, and it overflows, and now the bottom of your oven is all covered with gravy. So if you now bake challah in your oven, you bake bread in your oven, then you had the problem we just talked about in last paragraph, in paragraph 26, that the aroma from that gravy is going to go up and it's going to hit your bread. Therefore, you have to make sure to clean all that out before you're using this oven to bake bread in. Now, this could get a bit complicated in our ovens because we're not so concerned. Again, we don't bake bread on the bottom of our oven, so you don't have to be concerned that the bread is touching a meat surface when you're baking it. But let's say some juice from the roast went on the racks, and now you're putting in and it fell down to the oven, but there's no juice left. However, the racks now became meat racks, and therefore that could affect the pans that you put in. You're baking challah, let's say, and you have challah on your pyre of pans. You're putting the pans now on those racks. That could create a problem because those racks are meat racks. Your pans are pyre, and it might mess up the status of your pans. Therefore, make sure to put some foil down on top of those racks before putting the pans down. The best thing is to kasher your oven, so your oven will return back to a pyre status. But if you don't do that, at least put foil down on top of your racks so that the meat racks won't affect the status of your pyre of pans that you're using to bake your challah with. Paragraph 28. We're going back to the laws of Tereifah. I should have mentioned this earlier. Obviously, these laws of Tereifah are not so practical for most of us. We buy our meat fully kosher, already certified that it's not a Tereifah. But we're just going to go through. It's just interesting, just some random Jewish knowledge and halacha and random kosher knowledge. Just interesting stuff to learn about. So, paragraph 28. Another Tereifah concern, or potential Tereifah concern. If a chicken is castrated, it does not render the chicken a Tereifah. However, there's a concern that in the castration process, it could be that the intestines were nicked a little bit, and if the intestines were nicked and they got some sort of cut, then that might render the chicken a Tereifah. Says the Kitzer, we don't have to worry that castrated chickens are Tereifahs, that the intestines are nicked, because generally the people that do the castration, they're experts. Now, parenthetically, Jews are not allowed to castrate animals. And therefore, the only way this chicken can be castrated is if it was previously owned by a non-Jew who castrated it. Once it becomes Jewish hands, we're not allowed to castrate it anymore. And we're not even allowed to give it to a non-Jew to castrate if we own this chicken. So again, if the chicken is castrated, we don't automatically consider it a Tereifah. We assume it's good to go. If, however, after the chicken is slaughtered and it was castrated, and you open up the chicken inside, you see something looks off with the intestines, even if you don't see a nick over there, once something looks off, we get nervous. Maybe this chicken did become a Tereifah. Maybe during the castration process, something did go wrong, and therefore this chicken would now be considered a Tereifah, and we would not eat it. Paragraph 29. It seems like there's a practice that with geese, when they're fattening geese, the sellers would puncture the geese beneath their wings because it somehow or other made the wings look fluffier, it made them look fatter, and therefore they could have got swollen, and therefore they could get more money for this goose because this goose looks nice and fat. If you do see a goose which has a puncture beneath its wings, there's a chance that renders it Tereifah, so make sure to speak to a rabbi that's competent in the laws of Tereifah. And with animals as well, could have this concern. Sometimes if an animal eats too much, then the Shulchan Aruch says that it could become bloated, and they'll pierce the stomach of the animal in order to let air out or let gas out of the stomach. Piercing that stomach could render a Tereifah, and therefore a competent halacha rabbi who is knowledgeable in the laws of Tereifah should be consulted in that case. Now, something very interesting about this is a big problem nowadays, because what dairy cows are nowadays they're fed a diet that's very heavy in grain, and this is a problem which kosher certifiers deal with, that cows which have a diet which is very heavy in grain, they could develop a medical condition called a displaced abomasum. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it properly. Abomasum. A displaced abomasum. What this condition means is that the fourth stomach of the cows have four stomachs, the fourth stomach of the cow gets moved out of position a little bit because of this built up gas that's released from the heavy grain diet. And one of the ways of solving this medical condition is by puncturing the three walls of that stomach of the abomasum. And like we just learned, that might be a big Tereifah concern. And this is dealing with dairy cows. And the halacha with milk is that milk that comes from a non-kosher cow is not kosher. So if the cow has this Tereifah problem that's punctured in its fourth stomach, that might mean that any milk that comes from it is not going to be kosher now. So this is a big concern that the kosher certifying organizations deal with. But rest assured, if you buy milk which has a kosher symbol on it, it's for sure good to go, that you don't have to worry about this. If you are interested in reading up more about this, so just Google kosher cow punctured stomach, and you'll see articles from Star K. Other organizations will pop up about this whole problem. This concludes today's episode. Have a wonderful day, and see you on the next episode.